Now that the hull was sound and watertight, it was time to do the same to the decks. The different decks on Athena were done in different ways. The foredeck and cabin tops were 1-inch thick Douglas fir tongue and groove laid over teak deck beams. They were then canvassed over using a white lead paste for bedding. The canvas was then given 2 or 3 coats of shellac and then painted with an oil-based enamel. This was a very good and traditional way of doing canvas decks. After more than 70 years of service, though, the decks were a little worse for wear. There were several cracks and a whole bunch of patches in various spots. Fortunately, Athena had spent most of her life under covered slips. This meant that fresh water wasn't allowed to enter through the cracks in the canvas and rot out the decking. Here in Southern California, we don't have the luxury of covered slips. We were going to have to redeck the foredeck and the cabin tops in a way that was much more durable than the original decking. We first had to remove all the deck hardware, grab rails, tow rails, and cabin moldings. We then peeled the canvas off, scraped the white lead off, and sanded the decks with 36 grit abrasives. We did have to do a few minor deck repairs and some refastening where it was loose. We then, in very dry weather, saturated the decks with epoxy resin, working the epoxy down into the tongue and groove. In order to stabilize the tongue and groove, we applied a 9mm marine-grade plywood overlay. This was carefully fit, and all the seams were scarfed together. It was glued down with a pre-thickened epoxy resin and temporarily held into place using battens and staples. The plywood was then covered with 2 layers of 10-ounce fiberglass cloth and epoxy resins. It was then faired and painted with linear polyurethane. We then fit and installed new teak cabin top moldings, reinstalled the tow rails and the foredeck hardware. We decided not to go with the traditional open grab rails. Instead, we went with the molded solid grab rail. There are 2 reasons for this. One is they are much easier to keep varnished. The other good thing is it keeps water from running off of the cabin top and staining the windows and the cabin sides. The side decks and aft cockpit deck on Athena were laid in a traditional way with vertical grain teak and caulked with cotton. They had been worn down over the years so that the fastener heads were exposed. Dan, over the years, had watched me perfect a new decking system for solid laid decks. So Athena was fit with new teak decks and covering boards using this system. This system incorporates a bead of 5200 at the bottom of the plank. These decks are no-leak decks, blind fastened, and without any butt seams. Perfect decks for the perfect boat. Dan was a real stickler for keeping things original. Unless, of course, he had seen something that I had built that was just so much better. The boatswain sliding hatch had become a must-have. I over the years have crafted these sliders so that they don't leak. They're stable, they always work, they're easy to take apart and maintain, and they look elegant. Now that the hull and the decks are complete, we can start on the interior. These videos are made possible by efforts through the Maritime Preservation Trust. Your contributions and support make these videos possible. Please don't forget to subscribe, share with your friends, and become a member of the Maritime Preservation Trust.